Hey there YouTube, my name's Mark. Welcome to Bumbling Through Dungeons, the only show on the internet. Today's topic is combat encounters and making them interesting. So I think a good combat encounter is more than the sum of its parts, but in order to get to that point, I think it is useful to analyze and look at the various parts that make up the whole, because it's those that are going to combine in interesting ways to create a memorable experience for your players. So in an earlier video on voices, we talked about the different variables in your voice that you can change and modulate in order to create unique combinations that create unique characters through those voices at your table. And I enjoy this approach to creation a lot of the times. I think it makes for some very interesting revelations when you take things apart into different variables that you can modulate and tweak in order to create really unique combinations. So we're going to talk about several variables in combat encounters that you can dial up or dial down or add in or remove or change or tweak in order to create a lot of different kinds of encounters for your players. And I think one of the pitfalls, certainly one that I fell into briefly in one of my campaigns and quickly got out of when I realized that it wasn't going to be sustainable, is that when we think of creating exciting combat encounters, we think about creating large set piece encounters that are wildly unique in some way. And trying to do this all the time, one, is very hard, and two, it's going to water down a lot of your encounters if you're trying to do it all the time with your players. If there's something ridiculously unique about every time they enter into combat, then if everything is special, nothing is. But in doing this, I was trying to avoid something that I think is worth avoiding. And that is combat after combat after combat that feels very much the same. And I think the most common pitfall that creates boring encounters is combat after combat after combat of simply throwing a different monster at the party, rolling dice until one or the other side is dead. This is fine. This is the essence of combat, but if that's all you're doing, if you're not adding anything else to the encounters, and if it seems like it's just a new monster, same idea each time, eventually this is going to feel boring. It's going to feel boring for you. It's probably going to feel boring for your players. You might have players who are just happy to hack and slash their way through the next highest level of monster, and they're perfectly content with this. So in that case, you don't need this video. Just find an appropriate level monster, throw it at your party, and you're good to go. But to that end, I think it's worth avoiding that type of sustained generic encounter for many groups who will tire of it after a while. And I think the way to avoid this is with variance. And so we're going to take all of our different variables that we talk about and the different ways that you can tweak them to create a near infinite number of various encounters and encounter types that you can create for your players. And none of them have to be massive set pieces with some ridiculously unique element to them. You don't have to create an event every time that you have an encounter, but I do think that variance is the key to creating a sustainable campaign of interesting encounters for your players. So the first variable, of course, is the enemy type. And we already talked a little bit about this, and if this is the only variable that you're changing, then you're not really doing a whole lot with your encounters. But it is always useful to think about the monsters and creatures that you're using, and we're going to actually have a lot more videos later on talking about individual monsters and how you can use them in interesting ways, in creative ways. But I think that the one thing that I would consider here is whether or not your players are familiar with the creatures that you're sending at them. If you get too weird with it, there might not be any familiarity, but if you have players who've been playing for a long time and you're throwing orcs and gnolls and goblins at them, and they're probably going to say, we've seen all this before. I actually like plenty of those monsters. I think there's a time and a place for each of the three that I mentioned, but it's easy to have them seem generic, especially if you have players who have fought 100 orcs or 1,000 orcs already in their lifetime. So the next variable I want to talk about is enemy motivation. So this is where you're not changing anything about your encounter types necessarily. You're just changing what's going on inside the head of the enemy. And this can actually change quite a bit. So are they a creature who is out for blood? Is it really a fight to the death? A lot of DMs forget that a lot of monsters even have a sense of self-preservation and will probably want to run away at some point if they're losing a combat. So I think an easy way to make encounters seem natural and a little bit varied is to have some that will beg for their life or run away or just keep on fighting and get angrier, and they will actually fight to the death and won't try to barter or bargain or run. And depending on what their motivation is in the scene, are the players intruding on their homeland or on their nest? Are they trying to achieve some other end that doesn't involve direct combat with the players? Are they trying to do something else in this scenario or in this location? So knowing what the enemy's motivation is will automatically give you different outcomes or different potential outcomes to your combat encounter. And of course, one of the more obvious ones is a social end. We already touched on it a little bit, but the opportunity for intelligent enemies to say, hey, let's talk this out, let's not fight. That could happen at the beginning of combat. That could happen midway through combat once they realize, oh, this isn't going so well for me. Maybe I should try to figure another way out. The next variable I want to talk about, another somewhat obvious one, is the location. And just changing up the scenery and setting around your battles will give it a sense of being different from the ones that came before it. But I also think it's worth thinking about, all right, what is the setting? What's the location of this encounter? And what does that suggest? Does it suggest anything? If it's in a forest, are there other creatures running away or seeing what all the commotion is? If it's in a city, are there guards that are going to come running after 1 or 2 rounds, or that will show up after combat to interrogate the players? Figuring out what feels right within the location of the battle is going to give you avenues for making it come alive. So building off of the location is another variable, and I'm actually going to include 2. Sometimes I think of these 2 together, sometimes I think of them separately, but it's terrain and elevation. So what is the terrain, and does that say anything about the encounter? Are there dense trees? So are there plenty of places to hide, bushes and trees? Are there buildings to hide behind? Are there buildings to scale and climb on top of? So once you start to then think of elevation, if you're anywhere in the natural world, in the non-man-made world, very, very little of that is going to be perfectly flat. So are there rivers? Are there rocks? Are there hillsides? Is there somewhere that the villain or enemy can get the drop on them from a location above them? Are there choke points where the players could set an ambush or be victims of an ambush? So lots of different things like this. All you're thinking about is terrain and elevation, and it starts to give you all sorts of different permutations. Now we're talking about each of these variables in a little bit of a vacuum, but it's always a useful reminder to remember that all the different possibilities we talked about for enemy and all the different possibilities we talked about for enemy motivation and location and terrain and elevation, all of those can combine in different ways. And we're going to add 3 or 4 more on top of those as well. And there are probably variables that you can tweak in combat encounters that I won't cover in this video. So you might end up with 8 to 10 different variables that you can change, and there are dozens of different options for each of those, so that the ways that you combine them are near limitless. So I'm trying to frame this in ways that seem like it's flowing naturally. So if the location suggests terrain and the terrain suggests elevation, I think both of those things can also suggest cover, which is another interesting thing that I think a lot of groups, a lot of DMs don't use enough. I don't think I've used it enough or as much as I would want, because when you think about it, if you're in a firefight with spells and arrows and crossbow bolts, and some of it is going to be melee combat, but there's a lot going on at range, so anyone who can, I would think, would be trying to find as much cover as possible. Now, when I think about how much I use cover in my own game when I'm running combat at the table, the answer is not very often. So why is that? Why am I not using that more? Why are my enemies not intelligent enough to use that? So the fact is, the enemies are intelligent enough to be utilizing cover more often. It's me that has to change. So not only will this make your encounters seem more realistic if there's differences in elevation and terrain, and they're utilizing cover, your enemies are using cover, it's going to seem more realistic, but it's also going to give the players interesting challenges to overcome. How do they get around enemies who are making very intelligent use of cover? maybe they just keep blasting until they kill them, but there's probably a better way. There's probably a more tactical way to tackle that kind of problem. What is it? And that answer will be really interesting for your players to find. So now you have combat running and you have all your different variables and things going on, and it's somewhat interesting, I think, already. So now we can start to think about, is there anything else happening during combat that isn't necessarily related to the turn orders of the enemies or the players? And what I mean by this is certain events that could happen. So we sort of touched on it earlier when I mentioned guards in a city. So an event could be guards showing up after a couple rounds to see what the commotion is and try to break up the fight. That could be an in-world event that affects the outcome of combat or affects what the players do in a certain situation. And it doesn't have to be inserting a new monster or NPC type. It can be things like if you're in the house or lair of a particular creature, there might be naturalistic effects that happen during combat. One example of this that's baked into the rules is lair actions. And I think that you don't have to necessarily be as explicit as a lair action with a lot of things, but are there traps that could trigger because they're protecting their base? Things along those lines where it's not necessarily enemy v player, but it's part of the world that is reacting to the player's presence within it. Similarly, you could have, if you have a structure that isn't too well built to begin with and it's starting to take a lot of fire or spell damage, is it going to fall? What will that mean for people that are on it if it falls while they're on it? Are there rock formations that are loose? So these are the types of things that I would consider events during combat. The classic, somewhat cliche one is like the chandelier falling or being able to swing from the chandelier. So you start to give them elements to interact with, but what else is going on or what's being triggered by the combat and the presence of the players in this place? So at this point, I think you have a lot of different things that you can change up to make interesting, varied encounters in nearly any setting. And as you're exiting combat or getting to the end of your encounter, I think it's also useful to think about what is the victory condition for the players. Again, all too often, the only victory condition is beat the other thing into submission until it is good and dead. And that is going to be probably a majority of your combats, and that's fine. But I think it's worth throwing a curveball every now and then so that what they're trying to do is somewhat different. So do they need to keep something alive to interrogate it? That's a very classic example and gives them something different to have to do other than just kill the thing until it's dead. The victory condition could be something a little bit more esoteric. Maybe they're trying to frame someone for murder. So they're not just trying to kill someone, they're trying to kill someone in a very particular way without creating a lot of commotion. That creates an entirely new problem outside of just, there's the thing, go kill it. And of course, maybe the victory condition doesn't involve death at all. Maybe it involves taking a situation that could escalate into combat and de-escalating it into something that could be an alliance or a temporary pact. So modifying the goals of your players through the narrative, through what they're trying to do in the story, I think is important to give them a sense that maybe they don't have to always just be murder hobos killing their way through the entire campaign. The last thing I want to talk about is a little bit more holistic. So I'm saving it for last because I don't think it's necessarily a single variable that can be changed. But it's the idea of combat as narrative. And I'll explain what I mean by this in a little bit more detail in a minute here. But I first encountered this idea through a blog that Chris Perkins ran. I believe it was back in 4th edition. And it was a very interesting article. And I don't know where it is on the internet anymore. I can't find it anymore, or I would link to it down in the description, so I apologize. But he really laid it out well and opened my mind to what combat could be, to the different possibilities available in combat. And his central point was, oftentimes, the point of combat isn't to challenge your players with a challenge rating monster that's going to give them a run for their money and see who wins. That you can have narrative beats or a narrative purpose through combat that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the other variables that we talked about. I'll give you some examples because I think I'm doing a bad job of explaining it. So one of the ones that Perkins used that I thought was instructive was that he had a group of high-level players, So I don't know, they were probably in the second or third or even final tier of the game. So in 5th edition terms, it was probably, let's say they were level 15, somewhere in that neighborhood. And they were on an airship, and there was another airship that had been hijacked by goblins. Now, the goblins were trivial to this party of level 15 characters. Any one of them could have killed their way through the entire ship of goblins because they were so low level. But that wasn't the point of this combat. So yes, they did enter combat, but the goblins had bombs strapped to hostages. So now this is a very different situation because, you know, you're in an airship, it's flying along, there's bombs, so it could crash. So this could have implications both for the party and any other innocent NPCs on the hijacked ship. It also means that while players weren't worried at all about the goblins killing them or even harming them to any degree, they had to figure out a way to get through this situation, whether through combat or social or something else, in a way that saved these other people and prevented an explosion. This was a much different challenge than a group of goblins would normally present, especially to a high-level party. And frankly, none of the players were in any true danger. They weren't in danger of dying in this encounter, but something very bad was in danger of happening. So I think a classic example of this is like Superman. So there are a lot of Superman comics and Superman encounters where there's no actual risk of death for Superman. There's nothing that he's facing at a given point that's even going to be able to harm him. But that's not the point. The point is, can he save all of the other people? Can he stop the cataclysm from happening in time to save the city or Lois Lane or whatever it is? And that was the point of it, not will Superman die or not. So I think you can start to see that this is one example, but not the only one. So I'll tell you how I applied this idea in my own game. It was an encounter, the players had just re-entered a city that they had been in previously in the campaign. And the city was being overrun with demons. And so they were trying to find the source of this demon incursion, help the locals of this city as much as they could, and if they could, find some of their allies. So they're heading toward the epicenter of this demon incursion, and they run into a very powerful wizard, like the powerful wizard of this city, who was in sort of a retreat, but was leading the retreat with a lot of innocents who weren't able to defend themselves against these demons. And so they come in basically in mid-combat where this wizard is fighting off a number of powerful demons, and the point becomes aid the wizard in fighting off these demons while the rest of the citizens escape. So it had an element of save the hostages, just like the goblin thing, but there was another point to this combat that I wanted to have, and that was to establish this wizard as a badass. They knew of this wizard, but they hadn't encountered her previously in the campaign, and so I wanted this wizard's introduction to be appropriately badass. So the encounter wasn't designed to threaten the players. None of them were in any real danger, but one, there were a lot of like demon minions running about that they had to try to deal with quickly, or else they'd start to pick off the people who were trying to run away. And second, the wizard did most of the heavy lifting in the fight with high-level spells and was actually doing some tanking, so taking on quite a bit of damage but staying up. So even though the players collectively were doing more damage than this one wizard and taking more damage collectively, there were 5 of them and 1 of this wizard. So they definitely got the sense that, wow, this is a really intimidating, powerful wizard. And the wizard became an NPC ally of them, and they had a sense of the scale of power that they were dealing with. So I wanted this appropriately impressive introduction, and I was able to do it through combat. So this to me wasn't combat for combat's sake, this was combat for narrative's sake. And to take this full circle, one of the other reasons that I wanted to establish this wizard as an intimidating, powerful presence is that not too far in the distant future in the campaign, I knew that there was an enemy in this city who had mind control powers and could turn their allies against the party. And so they ended up having to fight this wizard. And you better believe that after that impressive introduction that I gave to the wizard, that the party was appropriately cautious and devoted all of their high-level spells and resources to making sure that they didn't die in the encounter. So for both them and me, it was a real fun twist to play through, because they think to themselves, oh, we have this really powerful, cool ally. This is awesome. We get to supplement our party with this really powerful NPC. But then the rug comes out from underneath them and they end up having to fight this powerful NPC ally, and suddenly they're a little bit scared because they know just how powerful they are. So 3 or 4 sessions in advance, knowing that this was not an inevitability, but a likely possibility that they would end up having to fight this character, I was trying to establish that respect, that awe, maybe a little bit of fear in the players 3, 4, 5 sessions prior to this fight in order to have that payoff. So I think that's a really good example of combat as narrative. There's probably lots of other examples. If I could find the article that Perkins wrote, I think he used 1 or 2 more. The Goblin one was the only one that I remembered from it. But the idea that you don't have to have combat for combat's sake, but you can be doing something within the larger narrative of the story through combat was revelatory to me. So I'm sure there's so many different permutations of that idea that you can incorporate into your game, and it's a goal of mine to find those because I think they're very interesting. So to go back to one of the points that I made very early in this video, I think one of the keys to creating a sustainable campaign of interesting encounters is just to have a lot of variance in the types of encounters that you give to players that have a lot of different considerations going into it, a lot of different tactics that they can employ during combat, a lot of different ways that it could end, a lot of potential outcomes, and I think it will keep you from getting into a rut in the types of encounters you throw at the players, and it'll keep them on their toes because they won't know exactly what to expect from you next. So if I missed anything, and I'm sure I did, let me know down in the comments, but I hope you got a few tips and tricks in order to change up your combats and change up your encounters, and in doing so, make it more interesting both for yourself and your players at the table. So until next time, take care.